So what ROI iAM offers on the table is the fastest migration from SAP IdM, best fit for SAP and non-SAP. As we have seen, basically, provisioning for any kind of system is possible. We understand actually how this is possible in just a second. It offers you to retain your investment, which you did so far for SAP IdM, without having to redo everything from scratch. And then innovation at your fingertips to start actually working on all of your due tasks without having to invest further into your old software and your old SAP IdM product. So how is this possible? As I mentioned before, we are looking at a very open event-based architecture, which runs completely in SAP BTP Cloud. And with that, we are also connecting to major SAP BTP services like SAP Integration Suite and SAP HANA Cloud, which most of the customers already have, or if not, they're already on their agenda for the upcoming years. And practically, these services are offering us the needed flexibility, which we combine with our knowledge in SAP IdM in order to build a brand new solution that is cloud enabled, it's elastic, it scales, and it offers you the needed flexibility which you had before with SAP IdM. How we achieve this, of course, is not through complete custom coding, because that would be unthinkable to recreate SAP IdM in a matter of a year. What we managed to achieve, however, is really to build something extremely composable, where different services are playing various parts in this scenario, and they play their part so well that actually at the end you're getting a product and a solution that works very seamlessly, and you don't actually see you're not jumping from service to service in order to do something. Rather, everything is configured and runs into one central cockpit, which of course I'm going to demonstrate to you in a few moments. Another key aspect is our integration with the existing cloud identity services, where probably for most of you, a common scenario nowadays is where SAP IdM connects to the cloud SAP systems, exactly thanks to the cloud identity services, and more specifically, the two sub-services called IPS and IS. Respectively, those services, you can keep them exactly as they are right now. There's no need to change anything there, and you can directly connect those to ROI iAM and keep using them as they are. We made this possible due to this seamless integration to those services in SAP BTP. For on-premise, logically, we want everything to stay secure, so we're using the connectivity and destination services. And through the cloud connector, we can talk to any SAP on-premise system, respectively, in terms of provisioning, but also in terms of onboarding those applications in any other leading IAM of choice. This is our green box on top, where we've shown you scenarios that were including Microsoft Entra, SAP GRC, and SAP IdM. But practically, any of the solutions you have seen in the survey, or any other solution that potentially could speak scheme or consume and send events to our framework, is a possible candidate. And the only thing that this leading IAM actually needs to take care of are things which usually they are very good at. And those things are, of course, every IAM solution should be able to onboard applications. That's kind of clear, because otherwise they won't know like what roles are there, which identities have already roles assigned in the system, and so forth. Identity lifecycle, typical scenario. Whenever a sync comes in, doesn't matter if it's SuccessFactors, if it's HR, SAP HR, or Workday, or any other application. The moment you sync, you need something to happen. This would be, let's say, a user is onboarded, like a create user changes position, user leaves the company. All of these lifecycle events, they can be triggered from this standard leading IAM of choice. And then, last but not least, of course, you need a user interface where your end users will be able to first log in, browse the catalog of available permissions or business roles, of course, request those and get those approved if there are approvals, and after that provisioned to the backend. We also enable another interesting scenario, thanks to the connection to GRC, where we also could embed the risk analysis into the process within ROIAM, meaning that once you request access in any of the leading solutions, and this access is sent to SAP BTP, respectively ROIAM, you'll be able actually to run a risk analysis in SAP GRC, respectively SAP IG, and based on this risk analysis, take further decisions if this access will be provisioned, rejected, or mitigated, respectively. All right. So much about the architecture. I think it's time now to jump into the demonstration. And for this purpose, I'm just going to switch again to our cockpit and show you a few things. Okay, so we are in the cockpit of the Intelligent Access Management from ROIABLE, or shortly ROI iAM. And this cockpit gives you access to very powerful tools which you can use to actually configure how all these flows we have seen before are going to be used, operated, and how you can actually configure them. Let's start with the system landscape, which represents more or less a mind map of your landscape. And it contains two major areas, I would say: the bottom part, which has the target systems in place, and the upper part, which has the source systems in place. And all of these systems, they are actually available in a very similar way like SAP IdM handles these systems. The first level on the top and the first level on the bottom represent the repository types. And we can look at some of those. They provide certain events and certain processes which are already predefined for these repository types. Each repository type can have as many repositories as you would like from that type. And of course, those repositories are inheriting, you can see here, the processes which are already defined in the repository type. That's, however, not necessary to inherit. You can also override these processes and run a very specific process for the repository, which is not even defined in the repository type. Then what we have also, of course, is a enable-disable button, which you also had previously in SAP IdM. But what we also offer here actually is a repository type enable-disable button, which automatically is going to disable not only the particular repository type, but also all the repositories of that repository type. And because we believe that this is not also enough, we also implemented a general switch where you can enable and disable the complete provisioning for any kind of source and target systems just by switching this switch here. And as you can see, it tells you, okay, are you sure you want to deactivate all systems and all repositories just with one click? Of course, we don't want to do that. And logically, this kind of functionality would be something that's protected a little bit more than everything else, so that we avoid any mistakes. All right, what we can see here as well, for example, for Entra, what was interesting is that in the source part, we have an event name called create identity. And you might logically think, okay, why in the source we have a create identity? The reason is that actually for the Microsoft Entra scenario, we are sending only a particular unique identifier out of Entra to ROI iAM, and you'll see this also later in the event log. And this particular identifier needs to be resolved by our solution into what exactly that means. And that's why during the creation, we are doing a process called data enrichment. And as you can see, this is not set on the level of the repository type, but we set it here on the level of the repository. And here for the event ROIAM create identity, we have an enrich process, which actually we can also take a look at. And we can see it consists of two steps. It's actually quite simple. It has a data enrich mapping step, and it also has actually the actual call to Microsoft Entra. The interesting part here is that, as you see on the right, we have various interfaces, various mappings which are happening, but you don't see the actual mapping. Now, okay, why this is happening and how it comes that we know what to request and what to get back from that system. Now, that's a very good question, and I think we're going to get the answer of this one in just a second when I show you the top level data model, which contains the 5 various tiles. And we're going to start with the sources. And to continue my explanation, the sources are various interfaces and as well schemas which represent certain data models. Let me give you an example with IDM. IDM is the data model where most of you are already, of course, aware from SAP IDM, the standard, let's say, schema, it's called there, and we call it schema here as well. And with the initial installation and setup of our product, you get that schema already predefined in the product. And this schema is going to represent exactly the schema from SAP IDM with all its necessary configurations in terms of types, size, default values, or whatever comes standard in the SAP IDM product. This allows us to have a default mapping between this particular schema or any other schema for this, for this matter, to our internal model, which automatically means that we can map anything out of any of the source systems to our internal model the moment we know how the schema looks like. And this is one key differentiator compared to other products where you are expected actually to be an expert in all kinds of different systems. When you connect, let's say, in SAP IDM, you connect SAP S4HANA, you need to know what's the structure of S4HANA. When you connect to some other system, you need to know what's the structure of that system, what attributes it has, how to map those, and so forth. On our side, actually, we're using the schema which the product itself is offering. And we'll see this also later in the event log, where you see that the event that was sent from IDM by iAM before, it contained attributes that were from IDM. But the very same call that was sent from GRC contained the attributes from GRC. So we don't expect that actually the system on the other side knows about the data model of ROI iAM. It's exactly vice versa. We adapt to that schema and we have that internal mapping that takes care of things. Let's look at the targets. And the targets, they work more or less the same. So again, we have interfaces. Again, we have schemas. Of course, here, the idea is that those interfaces and those schemas are applicable to the target systems you have seen before in the system landscape. And let's look at one example. This is the create user for Salesforce. You see here we are defining all the necessary data for how this operation is going to be executed. It's a post. It's there's an endpoint. There is a response schema. We have here the structure which needs to be sent with the different attributes, and respectively, we already know what Salesforce expect when they say, "Okay, please create a user there." Those schemas, of course, are extendable, and you have to do that anyhow because personally, in my 15 years experience of SAP IDM, I haven't seen anyone actually not changing or at least not adding a custom field in the schemas of the various attributes and entry types in SAP IDM. So logically, you need to adapt that. But we have thought about this as well, and I'll show you a bit later during the migration enabler demonstration how this can be tackled. Now, one question which actually remains unanswered is how actually we are reaching the actual target system just by putting this endpoint here. As you see, there is no host, no port, how actually this communication happens. And this happens in a very simple way. Let me go back to the system landscape and show you the target for Salesforce. Yeah, Salesforce. Okay, now what we can see here, there is a destination. This destination actually is something that is a further integration of our product into the SAP BTP platform. And for those of you who had the pleasure to work with the cockpit there, you know there are various destinations there with various options for using the authentication to all kinds of different systems. And exactly this is what we are reusing. We don't want to build things which are already there. Rather, we are reusing the destinations defined in SAP BTP, and we are just consuming them here in order to connect to the needed repository. The only thing that's left, obviously, is just to define, okay, I'm connected to the server now, but which endpoint I have to call, and this is exactly the place where we define the endpoint. Now, going to the attributes, you can think of them a little bit like the attributes in SAP IdM, but in a more structured form. So this means that we are not creating attributes one by one, rather we are creating them inside of schemas. In these schemas, the idea is that they're grouping these attributes in some meaningful structures. And this actually simplifies things a lot, because you still have the flexibility to create your own attributes, but the only thing you need to keep in mind is that you need to group them into various attribute schemas, which again also could be custom. These attribute schemas are then used in the model entities, but before we jump into that, let me show you something interesting. We also kept the various add, modify, and delete events from SAP IdM to make things simpler during the migration, because we know a lot of customers are used to using them, and basically they expect also the new IAM of choice to be able to handle such events. And unfortunately, for most of the available solutions, that's not the case. But let's look at the model entities. And the model entities are the representation of an entry type in SAP IdM. And looking at into identity, which you would kind of map to MX person, we have a combination of various attribute schemas, which we defined and saw before. And these attribute schemas could be either switched on or switched off, depending on the fact if we want this attribute schema to be part of this model entity or not. Then additionally, we also have the events on the level of the model entity, which are add, modify, and delete. And then you can potentially define a process also to handle these events directly on the identity level. One other thing, which I think is quite new in the whole concept, are the events. And why these events are here, I think the answer is clear. I mentioned events so many times that, and after all, we are also event-based product, meaning that these events are the source and the target of anything that happens within our application. And you see also later how an event looks like, so that you're not so scared about it. It's really just a JSON, which is a very simple structure, and you can just put a REST call to create an event. But these events, first of all, of course, we deliver the standard events out of the box, but you can also create your custom events. An event, what an event actually does is it has a name, which is the ROIAM create, then it has a model entity binded to it, in this case ROIAM create identity, and then this event is binded to a repository type for which it is supported. And of course, for each of the supported repository types, we also could have a validate process or a target process that could actually execute this process further on in the platform. Now, let's go back and look into the processes, because okay, we mentioned events. Events are triggered from the various IAM systems, being Entra, being SAP IdM, SAP GRC, but those events at the end are triggering processes. So where are those processes? Those processes could be found under the Process Explorer. And this Process Explorer has various connectors, and these connectors we can explore, let's say, the create user of S4. And here, what we see is a diagram, which is, of course, fully configurable, and I'll show you this in a second. What you can do here is you can define various steps in this diagram, and these steps, they can also be configured with various mappings and various calls to the backend in order to perform the needed steps. For those of you who are aware of how the process diagrams work in SAP IdM, this is the better version of what SAP IdM had to offer there. We have much more flexibility here and much more options on how to communicate also with external systems, but not only with ROIAM. The other nice thing about this editor are the annotations. And annotations, if used properly, could be something that really describes the whole process just by looking at it. You don't need any kind of documentation specific or any other helpers. If those annotations are maintained in a good way, you can actually read the process just by reading at the annotations. Now, I promised you that I'm going to show you how to build the process, but actually you see here that my edit button is disabled. Well, that's not a bug, it's a feature. And the feature here is that we are enforcing this disabled edit button through the versioning of our solution. And this versioning, you can find it under this click here in the top right. And this versioning, I would say, is quite unique. And what it offers is a way to configure various objects into particular version revisions, respectively then activating them and making them the default version for running your scenarios. Why this is important? For those of you who are familiar with SAP IdM, I believe you already know the answer. And the answer is that in SAP IdM, whatever you change in SAP IdM and you click on the save button, that's already the reality for everybody accessing SAP IdM. And we wanted to avoid that because this led to not one and not two disasters in this area. And basically what we wanted to do is to give an opportunity not only for developers, not only for testers, but also for key users to perform full-scale tests on a particular configurational version before it is activated. Because active versions are such versions which cannot be changed anymore to a certain extent. I'll explain in a second why. But active versions, you cannot really change. You cannot create new processes. You cannot change processes. You cannot create new interfaces. You cannot change model entities. All of these configuration options I've showed you, they are locked in the active version. If you want to really change those, you need to create a revision. And revisions, in this case, could be personal or shared revisions. Respectively, if it's personal, only you can work on that revision. If it's a shared revision, then there is a group of people that are working on certain changes within this revision. Obviously, these shared and personal revisions later on can become active versions, but this is just, in the future when those are tested, when those are validated against the target configuration, and then they can be activated to become the default version for everybody else who are not testers and not key users. Now, let's see what is actually possible in the active version. For this, I'm just going to jump out and go to the system landscape. One of the things which is possible in an active version, and that's also quite logical, is that you can create new repositories out of any of the repository types you already have, because obviously this is not a configurational change. Rather, this is something like an operational change. You want to add a new system. You want to configure an existing system with the, let's say, a destination. You want to maintain a destination. You want to connect the system. You want to disable a system. That's also something which is operational. So to answer the question of what can be done in active version, let's say you're basically just looking at operational topics, which can be done in an active version, but everything related to development, to bringing new processes, new interfaces, new schemas into the solution, this is part of the development cycle, for which you require to have a revision. So let's see now, I'm going to change actually my version to a revision and see how things change. Let me go again to the processes. And I'm going to expand here, and let's look for, again, S4, that's fine, and pick here the target. And you can see already that I have the actions button enabled, and I can add a process. Let's call this process create user 10. Okay, this is generating an empty process. Now, this empty process, I'm going to edit it, and I'm going to start configuring it. And you can see I can create various elements here. I can create a mapping. I can create a split. I can create a service call. And then I can go further with sub-process or whatever. So basically, all of these elements, you see, are created initially as disabled. I can first change this to enabled very easily here. You can see that's gone. I can give it a name. Sorry. I can give it a name. Let's say webinar mapping. And as I explained before, annotations are very important. Okay. And then I'm just going to put it on the next line and then click here. There we go. All right. Annotations, of course, can be switched on and off. That's something like a functionality we have because we know that sometimes developers don't need annotations. They already know what's happening in the flow. So yeah, they just say, okay, annotations are for somebody else, not for me. Then another interesting aspect is this mapping here we have. And when I click on this mapping, what's going to happen is that we have all the mappings that are coming from CI. So practically for our mappings, we don't want to burden you with just another editor that can do mappings, but we believe the CI editor is extremely powerful, and that's the one we're using for our mappings. That's why all the mappings from CI are available for you to pick here. And when you pick a mapping, this mapping will be executed on this particular step. Okay, then let's, yeah, we can save this, of course. And let's go back to our original active version. And let's look for this process that I just created. And you can see it's not there. And that's exactly what I was saying. If you want to test this new process, create user 10, you would need, first of all, special permissions. And second, you will need to provide the needed revision, which you want to test in the call or in the event that is about to be executed. Okay, then let's look very briefly on the change management. This is the place where you are able to create new revisions, new versions, activate versions, deactivate versions, look at the archived versions, and so forth, transport versions as well. So this is basically your major cockpit to do that. And one thing we didn't show yet, and that's actually quite interesting, is the event log. And the event log, you can see, and that's what I wanted to show you. Let's look at the IDM event for create identity. And what I wanted to show you is how the event data looks like. And the event data, you can see that the fields which are sent from IDM, those are the standard schema events from SAP IdM. And then there are some additional fields which we're going to talk about in just a second. But what I want to do before that is just pick the same event, but from SAP GRC. Now let's look what you see. The data structure is completely different. But nevertheless, both of them created a user where they had to create one. This, of course, works due to this automatic mapping, which I mentioned before, between the schemas, which we have already loaded in our solution, and our internal data model. Now, there are additional event fields and attributes. As you can see here, for example, 88 was the request ID, which Milena approved in GRC. We have the source system, which is ROI GRC def, and we have also the target system, which is the ROI SF def, and we have the type, which is the ROI iAM create identity. And by that time, you should already realize actually why all of our connections, no matter if it was from GRC, from Entra, or whatever, always just work the same. Because the only thing we expect anytime, no matter if you're doing create, if you're doing grant, revoke, disable, enable, every time it's just an event. And the event doesn't matter. It could be, it's just a JSON, and practically you can just replace create with grant, and this would trigger the grant process. Of course, you need to adhere to the data schema that is provided. You need to adhere to the data structure that is provided to match the schema and so forth. But those are things which are quite easily managed outside of the solution. Okay, so far for the presentation of the our solution. And what I want to show you now is the migration enabler, which actually complements the product and makes the migration of SAP IdM just like a breeze. Yeah, really. We have a similar solution diagram where SAP IdM migration enabler is just a SAP IdM package which you put on your system. And the key here is that, of course, many other vendors also have packages in SAP IdM. But the key here is that we are not capturing your complete system, because your system of how SAP IdM works, we already know how it works. And you know how it works. And basically, why do we need to repeat everything? Yeah. That's why what we are doing here is actually capturing only the delta between what we know and what we don't know. And this delta is represented, of course, in the various mappings you have changed to the various systems, because potentially, of course, if you are provisioning to SAP, I highly doubt that you changed all the mappings to the SAP system. So, of course, we have those standard mappings. We have, the first name and last name and email and parameters and all these other things. But probably you are provisioning something more. And that's what we want to know. What more you are actually provisioning. And just to demonstrate you this live, it's going to be a bit technical now, but sorry for that, in order to show you how it works. We are creating out of this package database tables, which are reporting to us very interesting things. Like, for example, here we can see for the attributes that usually a standard attribute like MXFS personal number is manager is used in a non-standard attribute within a SQL query. Yeah, and this applies actually twice. And then we have it for different object stores. So we're not only looking at your primary store, because actually using staging areas is very common thing in SAP IdM. So we're looking across the whole SAP IdM for usage of these attributes and how these attributes were changed, because we have that as well. We have here, you see, for example, if somebody deleted a particular attribute, we know about that, even though it's a bit hard to find deleted attributes. But you see here action type deleted, and it was deleted from ID store 20, where the original ID store was 19. And then we have also modified, so you can see exactly which attribute when was modified, how it was modified, in order to migrate exactly only these changes to our solution.